Hello, everybody. This is Mike back with round two of the Billerica Wachusett club match. I'm paired again with Jeff Caruso, who has white, and I'm playing black. Let's get right to it. Jeff opened with e4. I played c5, b3. A little bit of a surprise, and it's kind of unusual. I don't see it very often. Knight c6. Pretty natural bishop move. d6, bishop c4. At first, I didn't like the positioning of that bishop because I probably could force it away from there, but then I started thinking, well, maybe he's setting up for some sacrifices on f7, and we'll just proceed as if it's a normal game and just not chase the bishop. Knight f6, knight c3, e6. I wasn't really sure, was he going to play d3 or d4? Castle either side. I thought, well, I'll just play the, Scheveningen pawn structure at that, and then develop, and then just we'll play. Jeff surprised me a little by moving the bishop again. I guess not being able to get to f7 encouraged him to try another plan. So my choices are develop a bishop, play a6 and ignore it. I ended up playing a6, and he took the knight. So I don't really mind this position. It doesn't always work out too well, but it's a pretty good pawn mass in the center, and maybe I can mobilize it and gain some space on either side, depending on where he goes. Jeff played queen e2, and I played d5. Now, I don't know if I like this move too much anymore. The alternative maybe would have been e5, where I'm already holding the knight from, keeping the knight out of d5 with the c6 pawn. And what happens is he can play e5. I can't play my knight over to g4 in order to attack the pawn, and so I play it back to d7. Jeff grabbed some space and protected the pawn a little better, signaling that he probably wants to storm the king side. The key there is you don't want to be pushing your pawns on your king side in order to give him any kind of a hook to sacrifice on. In games I've played in this kind of a motif, I find that if you can get to the queen side pretty quickly, then it deters white's king side attack while they're wasting a lot of tempos getting there with the pawns. Tempi. So I played bishop e7 in order to cover this h4 to d8 diagonal. Checking over here on h4 with the queen didn't make any sense. He'll just play g3 and then support his advance, so that doesn't make any sense. But I need to mobilize some pieces because I might have some center space, but he's got a lot of space and freedom of movement, so I've got to do something about that. Jeff played knight f3, and I castled. Another thought I had was to play a5, and then my bishop can come to a6, which would discourage any castling on the king side because of the skewer on the queen and rook. But he could always just play d3 to get out of that. And this idea figured quite a lot into my approach to this game. So maybe seeing all that, Jeff played d3 right away, and I started thinking, all right, so I could make use of this pawn advance But in order to make anything of it, I'll have to give up, I could have to give up the d5 square, and then that opens up e4 to his knight. And with an advanced e5 pawn, it doesn't look too appealing because a knight here could get to f6 even for a sacrifice, and my king side gets cracked right open. So I started looking around at other things I could do, and I thought, well, if I ended up giving up with a pawn push or a take, the d5 square, maybe my knight could go there and then attack his f4 pawn or get behind his pawn advances. And so to do that, I played knight to b6. Jeff proceeded with taking up some space, and I proceeded to prepare bishop to a6 on the grounds that I would eventually play c4. But as you'll see, it's a little slow. And in response to that move, Jeff played knight g5. So it's a bit of a fishing pole attack. If I play h6, he can ignore the pawn move and play his queen up to h5, and I have no defense along the h file. And my other choice is to play f6, and if he takes, I can protect that tender e6 pawn with a rook takes pawn move, rook takes f6. But I'm getting a little bit uncoordinated, and next thing you know, this knight has a sacrifice on d5 because it unveils the bishop attacking the rook. And so I didn't like any of that, and so I had to find yet another move. And then my third choice is to keep White's queen out of h5. And so I chose g6 to do that. The idea would be if he advances f pawn, I can take it with the e pawn. And if he advances the h pawn, I can ignore it and try to bring a defender over. So he played g4, and I played a move that, in hindsight, it doesn't look very good because of where you'll see the really tender part of my position becomes. But my idea was that I need to protect these two pawn bases. I can do one by moving the rook to h8, and I can protect the other one with the move I made, which was rook a7. Okay, so it doesn't really accomplish very much. It disconnects my rooks. I'm hoping it protects the base of my pawn chain. I'm happy to take off his knight as soon as he advances his h pawn, in which case these two squares will have doubled pawns on them, and it might clog up his attack a little bit. So rook a7. Jeff played h5, and like I said, I took off that knight, and he took back. So I could maybe take that pawn. The g4 pawn is protected by the queen, so I'm not going to be able to roll into a little bit of more space gaining or tactics or anything. Another problem is having moved this knight to b6, I don't cover this e5 pawn anymore. But if I could capture this with my queen and my knight was still here, then I could think about maybe pinning his queen to his king and forcing the exchange, in which case I like my center pawns a lot better than I was in the near future. So I played G7 in order to get the rook to H8. And I think that makes some sense. Now I've done what I intended to do. I don't like my minor pieces are offside, but one thing at a time. At this point, I saw that C5 was tender, and Jeff found it. BA3 is a good move. It allows him to play D4 with a lever on this pawn, and it's pinned. I had considered giving up the exchange here, but I thought that for the sake of that one pawn, I could defend the dark squares and the two pawns on F7 and H7. So we're at move 18, and things aren't really resolved, but white has all the pressure. Curiously, you'll see people castle, within 10 moves pretty routinely. I don't know the stats, 90% of the time. And within 20 moves all the time. I mean, everybody castles. But here, Jeff hasn't castled. And after the game, and I'll just say he doesn't castle. After the game, he was saying that he really wanted to castle, but he didn't think he had the time. And I don't even know now, looking at it, that he has to castle. This pawn center that I was so interested in can't move, because if it does, the knight comes to E4, and next thing you know, it's on D6, and if I'm not cramped now, I'm toast at that point. So, seeing that C5 was tender, I brought my knight back. It would have been nice if my rook wasn't already on F8, or wasn't still on F8, and I could have given up the C5 pawn and moved my rook somewhere, such that I could then hit back at the bishop on C5 after a take. But unfortunately, that's not true. So Jeff played the pawn lever, and at this point, I thought I probably have a reasonable chance to gain a tempo by attacking his queen with bishop A6. But I think it does more harm than good, because it opens up several more possibilities for him that contribute to attacking. The worst thing that could happen for him is my queen can take the G5 pawn, but he can easily defend that from either of these two positions. In fact, he could even get there direct, right away from F3. So it turns out I never do move my queen bishop, and I think, considering the uncoordination that I've faced, it would have been a good move. At least it would have. Activity for the sake of it isn't always good, but I have to do something here, because let's just say his rook and knight aren't really in play, and so the fact that my pieces are a little uncoordinated and aren't really on the king side to defend isn't hurting me yet, but it can very easily. So that informs why I didn't play bishop A6. So I think this is a mistake. I took this pawn, knowing full well that Jeff would play bishop to C1, but I felt like I needed to liquidate some of the pieces on the king side that he could use to sacrifice or be a pawn lever. In the end, I think this is one of the losing moves, in the sense that if these two pawns are doubled, it keeps him out probably better than he has a chance to come in. And so I think rook to h1 and maybe knight to f8, which then protects g6, would have been a little tougher defense. So I had to choose between two squares. I chose queen e7 because I was continuing to eye the defense of f7. Jeff took on g6, revealing a skewer on my king and rook, costing me the exchange. And I thought a bit about it earlier, but at this point, I actually go back to last week. We both played pretty slowly, maybe Jeff a little more. And this week, I am playing very slowly. I've got plenty of moves in the 10-minute range. This is the only move I made on the delay, which is game 90, delay 10, time control again. Rather than allow that skewer, I played rook h8 immediately, and that actually is another mistake, because aside from the material that I could have lost, Jeff starts to take over all of my kingside squares, and obviously I only have I can only do two things here. I could take the g6 pawn or go back, and I think it's another mistake. In envisioning this whole position, I thought I would take the g6 pawn, until I later realized that since we didn't resolve any of this area over here early in the game, his queen can come to d3 and check, and then I'm basically out of squares. It might even be mate. So I went back. After the game, Jeff had set this position up and was talking about it with one of the other guys, Fred Pearson, who pointed out that White has g7 and it's the game's over. But thankfully, neither of us saw that, and Jeff took the f7 pawn with check. So I didn't feel like I escaped because I didn't see it. What can I do to stay in the game? Well, if I take with the king, then the queen can come to the h file and then check on h5. And in response to that, the king can either go back to g7 or to e8. So let's draw that clear move by move. I can't give one guy all the moves and then the other guy the same number. So if black takes, queen h2, queen e8, queen h5 check, I can't go to either of those two squares. And if I go here, bishop g5 loses the queen for the bishop. So that is not a good variation. And so seeing less of what could happen, but knowing this variation is no good, I took queen takes f7. So whereas I missed the opportunity to play the bishop to a6 earlier and control f1, Jeff didn't waste time now, and he played rook f1, attacking my queen. I need to stay in touch with f8, and so I played queen to e8. And here, leading up to bishop to h6, Jeff took a really long time on one move. And I think bishop h6 is probably a natural, clear move. You know, the bishop isn't really getting much scope resolved over here on the through the center. But I think in the end, he was actually working out a couple of the possibilities that we've already discussed, but one that comes up, which is very nice. Jeff played Queen E3, and now he's got a real bind. He already has a bind on the dark squares, but now he has threats to just win the game immediately. And so in order to keep Jeff off of G5, I played Queen E7. So I lost another move here. Probably say I lost 5 moves altogether in Tempe. But then Jeff made, I wouldn't say the move of the game because, well, it was the move of the game in terms of the dramatics, but this position is dead one for white. And, well, if you want to pause for a second and think about it, but I'll just go ahead and put it on the board. It's rook to f6. It interferes with the queen's control, my queen's control of g5, gives his queen easy access. And seeing all this, I thought about resigning, but I thought, well, it's more sporting to play it out, and Jeff certainly earned what came of this. So I thought, well, let's just see if I'm missing something, and we'll keep going. So knight takes rook. Now my own knight interferes with g5, so queen g5 check, only move, queen g7 check. So only move is king to e8, at which point queen takes h8 check, and he's up a piece when he eventually takes my knight on f6. The problem is that if I do that, then I can hide, but then he'll go back here and take the queens off, or he could just take the knight immediately on f6. Now that isn't as good a move because, well, yeah, maybe it is. So anyway, to summarize this position, draw too many arrows, you get in trouble. To summarize where we are here, I resigned. I'm fairly sure I lose this this knight on f6. The queens are coming off. 2 pieces that he has only moved once are more than enough extra. My rook is completely out of play. This game is over. So Jeff won the game, played very well, I think. Billerica won the evening, 5.5 points to 1.5 points. Wachusett only won on board 1, and we had a draw on board 5. And as a result, Billerica won the club match. What is that? 8.5 to 5.5. So it was a lot of fun. It was nice to have a lot of people doing all the same thing and pulling one way. And it didn't work out, but it was a good time. So that's it. Thanks for watching. See ya.